In January of 2002, a group of 4 land surveyors were working in a lightly wooded area in Harris County, Georgia. According to the crew, they were all walking in the same direction about 50 feet apart, carrying on conversation. A 20-year-old named Christopher was last in the vertical line, and the person who was carrying on conversation with him said he looked back after not seeing Christopher for a moment, and when he turned around, he was gone. The search for him provided confusing and concerning clues, but despite the direction those clues pointed, law enforcement theories were, well, interesting, I'll say. The GBI is investigating this case, and with a never-ending push from his family as well as civil rights groups and activists, it's time they get answers. My name is Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the strange, unsolved disappearance of Christopher Thompkins. Christopher Carlton Thompkins had a regular morning with his mother, Ann Mackenzie, on January 25th, 2002. Sometimes Ann is referred to as Martha. My guess is maybe she goes by her middle name or it's a nickname. For consistency, I'm going to refer to her as Ann throughout this podcast because it's mostly what I see in the reporting. 20-year-old Christopher resided with Ann in the community of Ellerslie, Georgia. This is a small town outside of Columbus, Georgia in Harris County. It's located alongside Georgia State Route 85 and U.S. Route 27. The community's population is just over 1,000 people. While this community is small, it's considered to be part of the Greater Columbus Metropolitan Statistical Area, also known as the Chattahoochee Valley, which is a 6-county area of Georgia and Alabama anchored by the city of Columbus. All that's to say, you aren't too far off the beaten path in Ellerslie. There are bigger towns and cities nearby. Ellerslie itself is just a fairly quiet, unincorporated community. Christopher and his mother both had some overlap in their work, and on that chilly Friday morning, they were both heading off to work. Christopher worked for a land survey crew. It was a local business owned by a man named William White. His son Gary was part of the 4-man crew that Christopher worked on. Christopher was reportedly really happy with this work and enjoying his job. His mother Ann was a housekeeper and babysitter for Gary and his wife. So at around 8:10 that morning, Christopher kissed his mother goodbye and drove off in his car to work, where he met at the business and then carpooled to the actual work site with the man he worked for. He had just gotten the car he drove a couple of weeks earlier with the help of his grandmother, and he was really proud of it. The worksite on this day was in his hometown, and it was in a lightly wooded area off Warm Springs Road near County Line Road in Georgia 85. I'll have some pictures of this on the Instagram at simplertimecrimepod, and it'll be both Google Map searches that I found as well as some great maps put together by others on the internet, and I'll make sure I link back to those in the show notes as well. Christopher Thompkins was a black man, and of the survey crew, according to reporting in the Ledger-Inquirer, there was another black man who was working that day and 2 white men. Christopher was young, like I mentioned, only 20 years old, and he was a small man, just 5'7" and 130 pounds. Like many cases I cover, this one is prone to the same struggles as other older unsolved cases. There are conflicting details within different source material and a bit of the telephone game over the years. So what I'll try to do is just share the different ways it's been reported and point out discrepancies when I see them. But you as a listener may hear even more, and I encourage the conversation to continue on the social media posts on this case, because in this particular case, I believe that some of these discrepancies or story variations could hold keys to the answers in it. So according to the crew Christopher was working with, They were all working together that day, and some sources say that they had lunch and then kept working, and that's when Christopher went missing. But there's another source that says that one of the crew members called his wife on his lunch to discuss how Christopher was missing. Make of that what you will, but what we do know is that sometime between 12 o'clock noon and 1:30 p.m. on that day, it was reported that the four men were working and walking in a vertical line. Christopher was in the back of that line, and they were carrying on kind of on and off conversation. The third person in the line went to ask Christopher a question, and he didn't get an answer. It was then that he turned around, and Christopher was gone. At first, this colleague thought that maybe Christopher was just stepping off the trail to relieve himself. But after a few minutes, when he didn't come back, he and the other two men began searching. Now, we know from articles that one of the workers was the owner's son, but the identity of the other workers that day have never been released. At around 1:30 p.m., one of the workers called his wife and told her that Christopher was missing. But they apparently didn't immediately call for help and just did their own search. Christopher's mother, despite working for the family of the company owners, didn't hear that her son was missing until 4:30 or 5 o'clock that evening. Who tried to report Christopher Thompkins missing? I don't know. It depends on who you ask. Some say it was his family, some say it was the workers, but no matter what, whoever did try was told they couldn't begin an investigation for 24 hours. Not satisfied with that ridiculous answer, those close to him set out on their own search, and soon enough the sheriff's department did get involved as well. That first night they didn't really have too much time to search. Daylight was not on their side, sun was supposedly setting around 6 p.m., so that was difficult. So, ready for another discrepancy? We don't know who found these items, but this is what was found. One of Christopher's FUBU work boots. The work boot was hanging atop a barbed wire fence in that area that Christopher was last seen working, but it was a fair distance away from where they were walking in a line. It was on the completely other side of the property. Also caught on the fence was a piece of fiber and thread, presumably from Christopher's blue Dickie work pants. Next to the fence was also change scattered on the ground, 12 cents to be exact. Where the discrepancy comes in is that some sources say it was police who found these, some say it was family and volunteer searchers, and some say it was the crew who was doing their own little search. According to some sources, that is also where his work tools were collected, but other sources state his tools were left right where he was last seen, right on the ground where the men had been walking in a line. That is two vastly different spots, so I don't know if there were some tools found there and some found where the change was found and the boot was found, or if there's just two different forms of reporting on this case. We don't know. So to recap, one boot, a piece of his work pants, his tools were found somewhere out there, and 12 cents. The survey crew was not super talkative. They allegedly believed that Christopher just walked off the job, even though they had said it was just a normal day with him. And according to them, they had heard nothing. Not the sounds of his footsteps walking away, not the sounds of an animal nearby, not a confrontation or a scream or him setting his tools down. He had just vanished. Now, walked off the job to where, I ask? I don't know, because he didn't have his car with him. He carpooled to the job site, and he never went back to his car. The owner of the business was interviewed, and he stated that Thompkins had been acting odd in the week up to his disappearance, but he didn't elaborate. Or if he did, it hasn't been released. According to Sheriff Mike Jolly of Harris County, he said his team did a thorough investigation at that time. He said they brought in bloodhounds and cadaver dogs, as well as searched 2 area lakes. Despite it being winter and only one of Christopher's shoes being found and all the other odd, puzzling evidence and no signs of him, the conclusion police reached was that he had walked off the job, walked to a roadway, gotten into a vehicle, and that somehow maybe he made it to another big city where he had done drugs overdosed or suffered another fate, and that because he had no ID on him, he wouldn't be identified. Christopher's family said the idea of this was ridiculous. His aunt described how he had recently become a Christian man and had found God, and how that had brought meaning to his life and that he was happy. His mother said she lived with him and he was not acting weird at all in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Sheriff Mike Jolly defended his stance and said that Christopher's mother admitted he had used drugs the week prior to his disappearance and that he was paranoid. So where does the truth lie in that? We don't know. I just know that nothing about this passes the sniff test for me. Months passed with no signs of Christopher, and the next piece of evidence was found months later in July, and it was his other work boot. It was found on private property off of I-85 several miles away, and it was found in a marshy area. That's all the information that's ever been released about that discovery. It's reported that the sheriff tried to close the case within that first year, again leaning into the theory that Christopher just walked away and started a new life. But his family was adamant that that's not what happened, and a local civil rights group got involved. By September of 2002, Antonio Carter, the Georgia chair of the National Action Network, organized a formal protest of the police work in Thompkins' case. He shared that the group had two requests of focus. Number one, that all of the survey crew working with Thompkins that day be polygraphed. And number two, an outside organization such as the GBI take over the case and do a thorough investigation. It seems they were granted half of their requests. By end of September, the GBI was pulled in to investigate the case, but despite this presence, little was found. If Christopher had started a new life somewhere else, he hadn't used any of his money or his social security number or been seen anywhere. He hadn't made contact with his family, which he was extremely close to them, so that was odd. But this is still the direction the investigation went. Despite the crew being the last people to see him alive, they've never been considered suspects. So in 2004, dissatisfied with where this case stood, there were more protests. Carter was interviewed and said, quote, "It's a major reason why we are not ecstatic about involvement from the GBI in any case in which we have an interest. We've seen the work of the GBI before, and it was not impressive," end quote. He also stated that, quote, "If answers are not forthcoming, in the coming weeks, organizations including the local NAACP and Rainbow Push would set in motion a statewide protest of the GBI." That was in January of 2004, around the 2-year anniversary. They kept their word, and by June, another protest was held. At a press conference, Carter said that no one in Thompkins' family is satisfied with the investigation. Carter said that no one believes Thompkins would simply walk away, leaving behind his shoes on a chilly day. Even with this effort, nothing really seemed to move the needle in this case. The next time Christopher's name came up in the news was when bones were found in May of 2009 near Georgia 18 and I-185 near exit 34. There was a scattering of some human bones, and police were considering if they could belong to Thompkins or 2 other local missing people. As of this recording, those remains have not been connected to Christopher Thompkins in any way, and I couldn't find if they were identified ever. I went through the websites that listed John Does from the area found around that time, and I also went through the old newspaper articles, and it was sort of a one-time report in the media. So I know I have a lot of Doe Network sleuthers who listen to this podcast, and if you know the answer to my question on that, please get in touch. In the last 15 years, Christopher's case has sat cold, with news articles, with his family pleading for coverage, investigation, and to just keep his story out there. Christopher's mother said to the Ledger-Inquirer, quote, "What we found was puzzling and did not make sense in light of what Christopher's coworkers told authorities. We found one of his boots, his work tools, a blue fiber from his pants, and 12 cents on the ground near the items. The statements by his employer and coworkers indicated that they believed Christopher just walked off the job site without telling anyone. His other boot was found several months later, miles from the original boot, on some property off I-85. It was found by the owner of the property. She went on to say, "Chris lived with me, and I saw him every day. There was neither strange behavior on his part nor any distress. I am not a citizen with great influence. I am simply a grieving mother who wants to keep this case in the public light in hopes that one day someone will come forward with some information in what happened to my son." I want to take a moment to thank you for tuning into this week's episode. I hope to reach a broader audience, so please leave a 5-star review, tell your friends, and share the podcast on social media. I also take case recommendations for older unsolved cases at simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. Now, back to the show. Let's discuss some of the possible theories and how they match up to the evidence. Theory number 1. There is no foul play, but Christopher walks off the job site for some unknown reason, doesn't tell his colleagues, gets into a car off the nearby highway, and starts a new life. Now, he would have, in that scenario, needed to hitchhike or prearrange a ride, something that nobody has ever come forward to say they were the person who picked him up. He would have needed to inexplicably drive miles and miles and miles away to dispose of the one boot he was wearing because the other he left in the woods. And then, I don't know, in his socks, go someplace else without telling anyone, without having any resources, and manage as a 20-year-old to just start over under a new assumed identity or die elsewhere and never have it be connected. And I just want to reiterate that this is the lead theory that Georgia's Best came up with. If they've come up with a better one, they won't talk about it. And look, I cover a lot of cases, and there are many where investigators give it their absolute all, and they just can't solve it for reasons completely outside of their control. I'm not hating on those cops, but investigators and investigations like this bothers me. There is no way you can tell me they left it all out on the line and did their best. I'm not convinced. And if you're in law enforcement and work this case and hear this and disagree, I'd love to hear your side and what you've been doing on this case. I'll do a whole extra episode, but I digress. Number 2 is that maybe he had a mental health break or was under the influence of drugs and ran off. This isn't something you can completely rule out. His mom said he was fine, but we do have the boss who said he was acting off, and if we're being objective, we should listen to all sides. He was at an age where a lot of times these types of mental breaks happen in young men, and there are definitely some cases that are commonly talked about where I think that is actually the case. The thing I have with this theory that doesn't quite jive with me is that this area is a bit remote. I'll share some of the pictures, but there are houses that are not far from here. So they were walking in this area where it's patches of woods between roadways and houses. It's very surprising to me that if he had some sort of mental health break and say he just was stuck out there and died of exposure, that his body would not be found in those woods. They would have found it by now. There's a webpage that's now archived where a team who went by the name of Exit 9 Investigations did a deep dive into this case with pictures, and I'll link the archived page because you can still see it, but they identified 3 bodies of water close to the site of his disappearance. There is Cunningham Lake, Faulkner Lake, and Jenkins Lake, and they are all within about a mile of where he was last seen. I know there are volunteer organizations that do dives to look for remains. If you know of any, this would be a great case for that. So tag them on social media with this episode link. It can't hurt. Theory number 3 is foul play. I'm not accusing his fellow workers of anything, but I think a sound investigation of them is of course in order. In any missing persons investigation, you have to thoroughly vet out the last known people to have seen the person. According to source material, one of the men whose name hasn't been released did go to prison shortly after Christopher's disappearance for a violent, unrelated crime. And one of the crew members allegedly immediately lawyered up. Now, I'm a fan of lawyering up. It's good to have someone by you in the legal process, and if you're one of the last people to have known to have been around a missing person, it's wise to have a lawyer. That does not mean you're guilty, but I think it's just worth noting. It's odd to me that the survey crew has not been very forthcoming. Now, setting aside for a moment his colleagues being under scrutiny for foul play, you also have to consider the area they were in. So, did Christopher go off for a moment to relieve himself and he ended up on the land of the wrong person's property? Christopher is a Black man, and this is the Deep South. Racism is everywhere, all over the country, but you objectively have to consider that it's more dangerous for a Black man to wander onto somebody's property than their white counterpart. Full stop, it just is. Some of the questions that remain for me are, why were Christopher's shoes found miles apart? Why did it take so long for Christopher's mother to find out about her son? Why hasn't the investigation focused really at all on those last seen with him? How did nobody hear anything? One consideration I had, and one thing that has been mentioned online, is that perhaps Christopher took off running for some reason. Was there a disagreement with his coworkers and he was running from them because there was an altercation? Did he have a sudden mental break? Did he see some sort of animal and freak out? This could explain the barbed wire fence. He's running from something. He gets caught on the fence as he's running. His boot gets hung up. The change falls out of his pocket. But this area was apparently pretty muddy and marshy, and there were no other footprints and shoe prints that corroborate that. Also, if you've ever worn work boots before, they don't just slide off. That's kind of the point. It's a safety feature. So that just makes me wonder if the work boots and the change and all of that were planted as a distraction from what actually happened. We don't know. We just know that Christopher and his family deserve a complete and thorough investigation. One case I couldn't help but draw parallels to is a more recent one from October of 2018. The disappearance of Terrence Woods Jr. Terrence was a Black man who was a production assistant and was on the set of Discovery Channel's Gold Rush TV show in a remote part of Idaho. Terrence was accomplished in the industry. After going to school for film production and graduating from the University of Maryland, he went to London and got a double master's degree. Despite being just 26 years old, his resume was very impressive and he was a reliable worker. On October 4th of 2018, the 12-person crew made it to Idaho and they went out to dinner. The next day on the 5th, Wood's coworker said he was acting strange and had an anxiety attack. Then he collected himself and they went out to shoot, and Terrence started acting weird again, according to the crew members. When Terrence's father, Terrence Sr., later asked the crew what they meant when they said weird, they said, well, he tried to grab a drone out of the sky. Then, without warning, according to multiple witnesses, he took his radio and equipment off, dropped it on the ground, and just started sprinting full speed down a steep cliff/hillside. Apparently, members of the crew tried to chase after him, but the area was rugged and dangerous, and they couldn't catch up. He's never been seen again, and many people, including his father, are suspicious of those last seen with him. There is a Dateline Missing in America podcast episode on this case, as well as an episode done by my podcasting friend Lauren on True Crime BFF podcast, and you should check it out because she's very thorough. I also think of the case of Eric Hayter of North Dakota. He was a 30-year-old who had already overcome major health obstacles as a child, and he had a pacemaker in his chest. He had just started working with Kofel Plumbing and Heating, and the company had begun working on a sewer main project off Highway 22 in Dickinson. Normally, the crew would return back to Bismarck, where he was from, at 6:30 p.m., but on this day, Eric's fiancée, Jody, was waiting there for him, and he wasn't there. His crew said he had just walked off the job at some point. The last known contact anyone had with Eric was his fiancée, who spoke to him and This was confirmed via cell phone records. That was 12:04 p.m. She said everything seemed normal, but apparently 15 minutes later, the crew couldn't locate Eric. He had been denied holiday time off that he had requested, and they thought maybe he was angry and quit. So the crew left that day with Eric's lunchbox in hand, his backpack, and his paycheck, but no Eric. According to what the coworkers told police, Eric was last seen in and out of one of the trenches working to seal a pipe and collecting tools while the rest of the crew started backfilling holes. According to NBC News, one coworker assigned to backfilling holes had a call marked on his phone at 12:14 p.m. that day. A time the man said he was in the loader moving dirt. It lasted for 5 minutes. They told police they had not realized Eric was gone until the foreman tried to reach him on his cell phone around 1:30 p.m. Investigators pinged his phone and spent multiple weeks doing a ground and air search. And 5 days after his disappearance, they had begun excavating the site based on the directions and where to dig by the crew. But they were digging in the wrong direction. It would take another 3 years, May of 2015, and his body was found 6.5 feet underground and 10 feet away from where police had been digging. According to the same NBC News reporting, Eric's body was, quote, positioned in a manner that was consistent with dirt being pushed in on top of it while it was seated near the pipe or while it had been standing and had been forced to the ground. So in short, they were saying maybe he kind of got hit by accident. Eric's yellow hard hat was positioned underneath the face, and it appeared to have been knocked off when the dirt hit the body. Eric's body was transferred to the University of North Dakota Forensics Lab, and his pacemaker marked his time of death at 12:19 p.m., just 5 minutes after his coworkers began backfilling the trenches. The cause of death was ruled to be undetermined, and a sergeant with the Dickinson Police Department, presented the case to Stark County State's Attorney Tom Henning, and he declined to file criminal charges in the case, stating that the decision not to file charges doesn't mean he doesn't believe a crime was committed. Rather, the nature of the event makes it difficult to develop probable cause for a case, as it's unclear who is responsible. The family does not believe justice has been served and is pleading for the case to be reopened. You can follow their progress on the Facebook page, Justice for Eric Hayter. In all of these cases, these young men were out with colleagues in a remote area, and all of the other colleagues came back, but they didn't. And in all of the cases, there are still answers to be found. If Christopher were alive today, he'd be in his early 40s. At the time of his disappearance, he was wearing a black shirt, a blue and gray plaid jacket with a gray hood, navy blue Dickies work pants, tan FUBU work boots, which have been accounted for, and a black skull cap and a black watch. He had dark hair that was braided at the time and brown eyes. He may have a mustache, beard, or goatee, and he has a tattoo on his right arm of an ice cream cone with his nickname Chris written in vertical letters inside the design. The ice cream part of the tattoo is the head of a joker wearing a hat. If you have any information on the disappearance of Christopher Carlton Thompkins, please contact the GBI's Greenville office at 706-655-5842. You can also contact the GBI tip line at 800-597-TIPS. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. Please follow and spread the word about the podcast if you appreciate the work I'm doing. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back next Monday with a brand new episode.